Russia's war in Ukraine is no longer just fought on the battlefield. It has spread into global supply chains, energy routes, and financial networks. While missiles and drones grab headlines, another war is quietly happening at sea. Ukraine is now targeting what many analysts call Putin's economic lifeline, the Shadow Fleet. This is a secret armada of old oil tankers that helps Russia bypass Western sanctions. These ships have kept money flowing into the Kremlin. They have funded the war and kept Russia's economy alive. Now, Ukraine is attacking that lifeline. The Shadow Fleet includes hundreds of tankers that operate outside normal shipping rules. They sail under fake flags. They hide ownership through shell companies. They turn off tracking systems. And they move Russian oil to world markets without being noticed. For Russia, this fleet is essential. Without it, oil exports would collapse under sanctions. And without oil money, the Russian economy would face a real crisis. Ukraine understands this better than anyone. Kyiv can't fight Russia ship for ship. So instead, Ukraine uses an asymmetric strategy. It targets ports, logistics hubs, and tankers linked to the Shadow Fleet. The goal is to disrupt the money flow that keeps Russia's war going. Recent attacks show a major escalation. These strikes have sent shockwaves through Moscow and global energy markets. In recent weeks, explosions and fires have hit Russian oil terminals, refineries, and coastal facilities tied to the Shadow Fleet. Satellite images and open-source data suggest several tankers linked to sanctioned oil exports were damaged or forced offline. Russia tries to downplay it, but the scale and coordination of these attacks tell a different story. These were not random strikes. They were calculated blows aimed at Russia's economic survival. For Putin, oil is power. Energy money funds military production, pays soldiers, stabilizes the ruble, and keeps political support inside Russia. Since the invasion began, Russia has relied heavily on oil sales to Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The Shadow Fleet made this possible by bypassing price caps and insurance rules. If Ukraine disrupts this system, it chokes the Kremlin's cash flow. Ukraine's strategy marks a clear shift. Instead of focusing only on the battlefield, Kyiv is expanding the war into the economic arena. This is a tactic used by weaker powers against stronger ones: attack supply lines, drain resources, and raise the cost of war. Every tanker damaged, every port shut down, and every insurance rate raised weakens Russia's ability to fight long term. The impact is already visible. Shipping insurers are raising premiums for vessels near Russian waters. Some ports linked to sanctioned oil exports are seeing less traffic. Even buyers willing to ignore sanctions are becoming cautious. This uncertainty is exactly what Ukraine wants. War is not just about weapons. It's also about fear and pressure. Inside Russia, these attacks create a major problem. Defending the Shadow Fleet requires resources, air defenses, naval patrols, and intelligence that are already stretched thin. Every system used to protect oil infrastructure is one less system available at the front, and the secrecy that helped the Shadow Fleet now works against it. Hidden ownership and opaque logistics make coordinated defense harder. The Kremlin's public response is defiant. Russian officials claim oil exports are strong and the fleet is fully operational. State media calls the attacks minor incidents. But behind closed doors, the concern is real. Energy revenues are one of the last pillars supporting Russia's war economy. If that pillar breaks, the consequences could be severe. For Ukraine, targeting the Shadow Fleet also sends a message to the world. It shows that sanctions are not only enforced by diplomats. Military action can make sanctions real and effective. By attacking these hidden shipping networks, Ukraine is forcing the world to face the scale of Russia's evasion. This escalation also raises bigger questions about global shipping. The Shadow Fleet exists because of loopholes in maritime regulation, weak enforcement, and money that rewards risk-taking. As Ukraine exposes these weaknesses, pressure is rising on governments and insurers to tighten control. The war is no longer just in Eastern Europe. It is changing global trade rules. As fires burn in Russian ports and tankers face new dangers, one thing is clear. The war has entered a new phase. Ukraine is no longer just defending its territory. It is destroying the economic foundation of Russia's aggression. The Shadow Fleet, once a hidden shield for Putin's oil wealth, is now a visible target. The Shadow Fleet exposed how Ukraine turned sanctions into a weapon. To understand why Ukraine has those S strikes against Russia. Shadow Fleet are so dangerous for the Kremlin, it is essential to understand how this fleet operates and why it exists in the first place. After the invasion of Ukraine, Western nations imposed sweeping sanctions on Russian energy exports. These sanctions were designed to limit Moscow CS' ability to profit from oil while avoiding a global energy shock. On paper, the system seemed effective. In reality, Russia adapted faster than expected. The Shadow Fleet emerged as a workaround to sanctions. Hundreds of old tankers, many nearing the end of their service lives, were quietly purchased through intermediaries. Ownership was disguised through layers of shell companies registered in countries with minimal transparency. These ships often changed names, flags, and registration documents multiple times. Some sailed without recognized insurance, while others relied on questionable insurers operating outside Western jurisdictions. The goal was to create a fleet that could move Russian oil while remaining legally invisible. This system worked because global shipping depends heavily on trust, paperwork, and insurance. As long as oil reached buyers and no major incidents occurred, many actors were willing to look the other way. For countries seeking discounted energy, Russian oil delivered by the Shadow Fleet was simply too attractive to refuse. Over time, this network became vast, flexible, and incredibly profitable for Moscow. Ukraine, however, identified a critical weakness. While the Shadow Fleet could hide on paper, it could not hide physically. Tankers still had to load oil at ports, pass through choke points, dock at terminals, and to rely on coastal infrastructure. These fixed locations created opportunities. Rather than chasing ships across international waters, Ukraine focused on where they were most vulnerable, at the source. By targeting oil terminals, storage facilities, and port infrastructure connected to Shadow Fleet operations, Ukraine achieved something sanctions alone could not. It introduced real physical risk. A tanker can change its name, but it cannot avoid a damaged port. A shell company can disappear overnight, but a destroyed loading terminal takes months to repair. This shift fundamentally altered the cost-benefit calculation for Russia's sanction-busting strategy. The psychological impact was immediate. Shipping companies that had quietly participated in Shadow Fleet logistics began reconsidering their involvement. Insurers grew nervous, raising premiums or refusing coverage altogether. Crews demanded higher wages to compensate for increased danger. Each of these changes increased operating costs and reduced profit margins. For a system built on cutting corners, even small cost increases can be devastating. Inside the Kremlin, this created a growing sense of urgency. Russia's economy is heavily dependent on energy exports, and oil revenues have been essential for stabilizing the ruble and financing military production. While Russia still sells millions of barrels of oil each day, the margin for error is shrinking. Disruptions caused by Ukrainian strikes force Moscow to divert resources toward repairs, security, and alternative routes. Another critical factor is timing. Ukraine's campaign against the Shadow Fleet comes as Russia faces mounting economic pressure at home. Inflation, labor shortages, and declining industrial output are straining the economy. The government has attempted to mask these issues through state spending and propaganda, but energy revenues remain the backbone of the system. Any sustained reduction threatens to expose deeper structural weaknesses. The international response has been cautious, but revealing. Officially, many Western governments avoid publicly endorsing strikes on energy infrastructure, citing concerns about global markets. Privately, however, there is recognition that Ukraine's actions are making sanctions more effective. For years, enforcement agencies struggled to track Shadow Fleet vessels. Ukraine has succeeded where bureaucracy failed, not through paperwork, but through force. This raises uncomfortable questions for the global community. If sanctions can be bypassed so easily, what does enforcement really mean? Ukraine's actions suggest that economic pressure alone is insufficient, without credible consequences. By attacking the physical infrastructure that enables sanction evasion, Ukraine has redefined what enforcement looks like in modern warfare. For Russia, defending the Shadow Fleet presents a logistical nightmare. Ports and terminals are spread across vast coastlines. Protecting every facility is nearly impossible. Air defense systems, already in short supply, must be allocated between cities, military bases, and economic infrastructure. Every redeployment creates vulnerabilities elsewhere. Ukraine is exploiting this dilemma with precision. There's also a reputational cost. The Shadow Fleet relies on secrecy, but each strike brings more attention. Investigative journalists, analysts, and watchdog groups are mapping connections between vessels, companies, and ports. What was once hidden is becoming exposed. This increased scrutiny makes it harder for Russia to quietly replace damaged ships or reroute oil without detection. For Ukraine, this campaign serves multiple purposes. Economically, it weakens Russia's ability to fund the war. Strategically, it forces Moscow to stretch its defenses. Politically, it demonstrates Ukraine's capacity to strike beyond the battlefield. And symbolically, it shows that no part of Russia's war machine is untouchable. As the Shadow Fleet faces growing pressure, the broader implications become clear. This is not just about oil tankers or ports. It is about the sustainability of Russia's war effort. Every disruption compounds existing problems. Every delay reduces cash flow. Over time, these pressures can shape political decisions in ways battlefield victories alone cannot. Ukraine is betting that economic exhaustion will succeed where military stalemate has stalled. By turning Russia's greatest strength, its energy exports, into a vulnerability, Kyiv is playing a long game. And as the Shadow Fleet begins to crack under pressure, that gamble may be paying off. The economic shockwaves. How the Shadow Fleet strikes are hurting Russia. As Ukraine's campaign against Russia's Shadow Fleet intensifies, the consequences are spreading far beyond burning ports and damaged tankers. What initially appeared to be isolated strikes are now producing systemic economic shockwaves across Russia's wartime economy. The Shadow Fleet was designed to be resilient, adaptable, and difficult to track. But it was never designed to operate under sustained physical threat. That reality is now becoming painfully clear for Moscow. Oil exports account for a massive share of Russia's government revenue. Even under sanctions, these exports have funded military operations, social spending, and economic stabilization programs. The Shadow Fleet allowed Russia to maintain export volumes by bypassing Western price caps and insurance restrictions. However, when ports are disrupted, vessels delayed, and routes threatened, volume alone is no longer enough. Delays translate directly into lost revenue, higher costs, and greater uncertainty. One of the first visible effects has been rising transportation costs. With increased risks near Russian waters, insurers that still operate in this gray market have raised premiums sharply. Some insurers have withdrawn entirely, leaving ship operators exposed. Crews are demanding higher pay, citing danger from strikes and instability. Maintenance costs are increasing as aging vessels are pushed harder and repaired more frequently. These expenses erode the thin margins that made the Shadow Fleet profitable in the first place. At the same time, Russia is being forced to offer deeper discounts on its oil to retain buyers. Countries willing to purchase sanctioned crude now demand compensation for increased risk. This means that even when oil reaches global markets, Russia earns less per barrel. Over time, this revenue loss compounds, tightening the Kremlin's budget and limiting its flexibility. For a state already running a war economy, reduced income is a serious threat. Currency pressure is another growing concern. Energy exports help stabilize the ruble by bringing in foreign currency. Any sustained disruption to oil sales increases volatility. A weaker currency drives inflation higher, raising the cost of imports and fueling domestic dissatisfaction. While Russian authorities can intervene temporarily, long-term instability undermines confidence in the economy and increases reliance on emergency measures. Inside Russia, the effects are uneven but increasingly visible. Regions dependent on energy infrastructure are facing uncertainty as operations slow or halt for repairs. Workers experience delayed wages or reduced hours. Local governments, reliant on energy taxes, struggle to balance budgets. These pressures may not trigger immediate unrest, but they gradually erode the perception of stability that the Kremlin works hard to maintain. The Shadow Fleet's troubles are also complicating Russia's diplomatic relationships. Buyers, who once quietly benefited from discounted oil, now face reputational and logistical risks. Increased scrutiny from media and watchdogs makes it harder to deny involvement. Delays and disruptions strain trust between sellers and buyers. Even nations friendly to Moscow prefer reliable suppliers, and uncertainty pushes them to diversify away from Russian oil where possible. For the Russian military, the economic impact has direct consequences. Defense production depends on steady funding. Factories require materials, workers, and energy, all of which are affected by inflation and budget constraints. As revenues tighten, Moscow faces difficult choices about where to allocate resources. Protecting energy infrastructure competes with funding frontline operations, forcing trade-offs that weaken overall effectiveness. Ukraine is fully aware of these dynamics. By sustaining pressure on the Shadow Fleet, Kyiv aims to create a slow-burning economic crisis rather than a sudden collapse. This strategy recognizes that modern wars are rarely decided by a single decisive battle. Instead, they are won through endurance, resource management, and political will. Economic stress chips away at all three. International markets are watching closely. While global oil prices have not spiked dramatically, volatility has increased. Traders factor in the risk of further disruptions, especially if Ukraine expands its campaign. This uncertainty adds another layer of pressure on Russia, as price fluctuations complicate revenue forecasting and budget planning. Predictability, once a strength of energy exports, is now fading. The Kremlin's attempts to project confidence are becoming more strained. Official statements emphasize resilience and adaptation, but behind the scenes, emergency measures multiply. Strategic reserves are adjusted. Export routes are reconsidered. Security around ports is intensified. Each step signals vulnerability, contradicting the narrative of control promoted by state media. Another overlooked impact is technological stagnation. Sanctions already limit Russia's access to advanced equipment and expertise. Damage to infrastructure further delays modernization and maintenance. Over time, this degrades efficiency and safety, increasing the likelihood of accidents. For an aging fleet operating under pressure, this is a dangerous cycle that amplifies risk. Ukraine's strikes also carry a symbolic weight that cannot be ignored. The Shadow Fleet represented Russia's ability to outsmart sanctions and defy international pressure. Each successful attack undermines that image. It sends a message that no workaround is permanent and no system is immune. For allies and adversaries alike, this perception matters. As the economic costs mount, the long-term implications become clearer. Russia can absorb losses for a time, but sustained pressure forces strategic recalculations. Choices made today will shape the conflict's trajectory months and years down the line. Ukraine is betting that economic erosion will gradually limit Russia's options, narrowing the gap between military capability and political ambition. The Shadow Fleet, once a symbol of resilience, is now a liability. What was meant to protect Russia's economy is exposing its fragility, and as Ukraine continues to exploit this weakness, the balance of pressure is shifting, not through tanks or trenches, but through oil, money, and time. The endgame. Why Putin's oil lifeline may not survive. As Ukraine's campaign against Russia's Shadow Fleet continues, the central question is no longer whether these strikes matter, but how far their impact can go. What began as targeted disruptions has evolved into a sustained pressure campaign that threatens one of the most critical pillars of Russia Verdudes' war economy. The Shadow Fleet was never meant to fight a war. It was designed to quietly move oil in the background. Now, it finds itself on the front lines of a global conflict. For Vladimir Putin, this creates a strategic nightmare. Russia's energy exports are not just an economic asset. They are the foundation of state power. Oil revenue funds the military, cushions domestic hardship, and enables Moscow to project resilience in the face of international isolation. Every strike against the Shadow Fleet undermines that foundation, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing collapse, but through slow, cumulative damage that is far harder to reverse. One of the most dangerous aspects for the Kremlin is unpredictability. The Shadow Fleet thrives on routine, predictable routes, predictable buyers, predictable profits. Ukraine's strikes shatter that routine. Ports once considered safe are now vulnerable. Routes once seen as reliable are now risky. This uncertainty forces Russia to constantly adapt, diverting attention and resources away from long-term planning toward short-term crisis management. Defending the system is increasingly costly. Air defenses must be repositioned. Naval patrols expanded. Intelligence assets stretched thin. Each defensive measure comes at the expense of another priority. Protecting oil infrastructure competes directly with defending cities, military bases, and frontline operations. Ukraine understands this trade-off and exploits it deliberately. There's also a growing international dimension. As attacks expose the Shadow Fleet, pressure mounts on governments, insurers, and port authorities worldwide. Even countries that continue to buy Russian oil face rising scrutiny. Shipping companies fear legal consequences, environmental disasters, and reputational damage. Over time, this erodes the willingness of global actors to participate in sanction evasion networks. Russia still has options, but they are narrowing. It can attempt to expand alternative routes, invest in stronger defenses, or offer even deeper discounts to retain buyers. Each option carries costs. Discounts reduce revenue. Defenses drain military resources. New routes require time and infrastructure. None offer a clean solution. The Shadow Fleet was a workaround, not a permanent replacement for normal global trade. For Ukraine, the strategy reflects a deep understanding of modern warfare. Victory is no longer defined solely by territory gained or lost. It is measured in endurance, adaptability, and economic sustainability. By targeting Russia's oil lifeline, Ukraine is attacking the war's engine rather than its armor. This approach aims to shorten the conflict not through overwhelming force, but through attrition and pressure. The domestic implications for Russia cannot be ignored. While the Kremlin maintains tight control over media and dissent, economic stress has a way of surfacing. Rising prices, currency instability, and regional budget shortfalls gradually affect everyday life. The longer the Shadow Fleet remains under threat, the harder it becomes to shield the population from the consequences. Stability, once Russia's strongest selling point, becomes fragile. Historically, wars often end not when armies are defeated, but when economies can no longer sustain them. Ukraine's campaign echoes this lesson. By degrading Russia's ability to fund the war, Kyiv increases the likelihood of political recalculation in Moscow. Even authoritarian systems have limits, especially when economic pressure converges with military strain. The Shadow Fleet's future now hangs in the balance. What was once an invisible network enabling Russia to defy sanctions has become a visible vulnerability. Every successful strike reinforces a simple truth. No system built on secrecy and risk can remain stable under sustained attack. The longer this campaign continues, the harder it becomes for Russia to maintain the illusion of control. In the broader context of the war, this marks a turning point. Ukraine is no longer reacting. It is shaping the battlefield across domains. Military, economic, and psychological pressure are converging. The flames burning at Russian ports are not just fires, they are signals. Signals that the cost of aggression is rising. Signals that adaptation has limits. Signals that time may no longer be on Moscow's side. As the world watches Russia's oil lifeline come under fire, one thing is certain. The war's outcome will not be decided by tanks alone. It will be decided by who can endure pressure the longest, who can adapt faster, fund longer, and hold together when systems begin to fail. The Shadow Fleet was built to save Russia's economy. It may instead become the reason that economy finally breaks. If you found this breakdown insightful and want more deep analysis on global conflicts, hidden power structures, and the forces shaping our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you stories the mainstream media often ignores. Thanks for watching, and stay informed.